So you might think of climate change as, well, purely a scientific problem.
Or maybe, something for the politicians to sort out.
Right, exactly. But what if how we talk about it, and maybe more importantly, who we expect to solve it? What if that's actually deeply shaped by something like gender?
That's precisely the fascinating territory we're exploring today. This is really for you, the curious learner, someone who wants to cut through some of the noise.
Yeah, to understand the stuff that often gets missed, right? The human side, the social angles of this huge environmental challenge.
Exactly. We're going to unpack some really eye-opening research. It looks at how gender shapes our understanding of climate change itself.
And influences things like who we see as being most vulnerable.
Who we expect to care, who's supposed to be doing the caring work, and even whose expertise, whose knowledge is actually valued in this whole global conversation.
So where are we getting these insights from?
Well, we're drawing heavily from a really comprehensive study. It's based on in-depth interviews with women who are actively involved in climate work. And this research, it digs deep into what they call discourses, these powerful ways of thinking and talking that kind of frame how we perceive things and what we do about them.
The underlying narrative.
Precisely. You get a clear look at the complexities and honestly some surprising contradictions that pop up when gender meets climate action.
Okay, let's jump in. So first off, why does climate change seem to just dominate everything? It often overshadows other really urgent environmental issues, doesn't it? Like biodiversity loss or water scarcity.
It really does, and it's not because we don't know about those other problems. They're critical too.
So what is it then?
What the sources really pinpoint is how profoundly politicized climate change has become, especially in, many countries in the global north.
Okay, so it's less about the science itself and more about the politics surrounding it.
In many public debates, yes. It's not just debating policy details. Sometimes the very existence or the severity of the problem becomes like a partisan flag to wave.
I've definitely seen that. So taking a stance signals way more than just your environmental views.
Exactly. And the research points to, political elites, sometimes an organized anti-environmental counter-movement, even scientists arguing publicly. These are key drivers.
Controversy sells, grabs media attention.
Which leads to this huge spike in climate change stories globally, especially since the mid-2000s. It's just everywhere.
This complexity, it makes it really hard to tackle.
It does. In fact, some scholars, like Kelly Levin and her colleagues, they call climate change a super wicked problem.
Super wicked. Okay, what does that mean?
Well, think about it like this. Time is running out, right?
Right.
But often, the very people or systems most responsible for causing the problem are also the ones trying to find the solutions.
That's a conflict.
Yeah. Plus, there isn't really one strong central authority calling the shots globally. And maybe the trickiest part, there's this huge tendency for governments and individuals to just push the tough decisions off into the future.
Kicking the can down the road.
Basically, yeah. It makes the problem even harder over time. It's kind of self-perpetuating.
So it's way more than just a science puzzle then. It's not just about CO2 molecules.
Not at all. It really challenges fundamental ideas, these existing truths we have about economics, about politics, even how society handles change.
And our own perceptions matter just as much as, say, rising sea level.
Absolutely. How we understand it, how we feel about it. And this is where the media and also NGOs, environmental groups, come in. They play a huge role in shaping how you, the listener, assess climate change.
Right, because different outlets portray it differently around the world.
For sure. But they are all really influential sources, whether they're trying to communicate the science or push for specific policies.
Okay, so you mentioned these discourses earlier, these frameworks, these ways we talk about the link between women and climate change. This is where it gets really illuminating, you said.
Yeah, I think so. This study identified 4 really powerful lenses, 4 distinct ways this connection is framed. These aren't just abstract ideas, they really shape how we see the problem and crucially who we expect to fix it.
Okay, let's break them down. What's the first one?
The first, and actually the most common one found in the research, was the women as vulnerable discourse.
Okay.
It came up a lot, 22 times in the interviews. Over half the survey responses mentioned it. But it's really important to understand this isn't about painting women as just like helpless victims.
Right. It's more nuanced than that.
Much more. It's really a recognition of how existing structures, social, economic, political conditions mean that women often bear the brunt of climate change impacts. They're disproportionately affected.
Can you give us some solid examples? What does that look like for real people?
Sure. Think about women in places like Bangladesh, for instance. The research highlights how they're often dealing more directly with food insecurity, losing homes, being forced to migrate, all because of climate impacts like floods or droughts. And it connects directly to existing gender roles. Like, if women are primarily responsible for collecting water or firewood unpaid labor, what happens when climate change makes those resources scarce?
Their job becomes much, much harder or impossible.
Exactly. It hits their survival, their daily life, their family's well-being directly and immediately.
That makes total sense. And how do these daily struggles, like a drywall, connect to bigger issues you mentioned, like intimate partner violence? That seems like a big jump.
It is, but it's a critical link, the research highlights. Natural disasters, which climate change makes more frequent and intense, they really ramp up this vulnerability.
How so?
Studies after the 2004 South Asian tsunami and also major U.S. hurricanes like Katrina, Harvey, Michael, they all showed significant increases in intimate partner violence, IPV, and other kinds of abuse afterward.
Oh, so it's not just a global South issue then?
Absolutely not. It's a stark reality after disasters in the global North, too. The chaos and stress exacerbate existing inequalities and tensions.
But like you said, women aren't just one group. Vulnerability must be different for different women, right? It's got to be intersectional.
Absolutely crucial point. The study really stresses this. Vulnerability isn't monolithic. It's shaped by all these intersecting factors. Class is huge, age, disability, where you live geographically.
So like a wealthier woman heading a household might actually be less vulnerable in some ways than a man in a poorer household.
Exactly. In certain contexts, yes, simple, broad brush pictures just miss all that vital nuance.
And within this vulnerability talk, there's a concern raised about weaponization. What's that about? Sounds a bit ominous.
It is a serious concern. It refers to situations where this idea of women's vulnerability is actually used to justify policies that might be coercive or controlling. Well, the research gives the example that women's fertility is already being linked to climate concerns by some governments, some big international organizations, some NGOs. It really forces you to ask, who actually benefits when vulnerability gets framed in a particular way? It can inadvertently lead to policies that actually reinforce marginalization instead of helping.
Okay, that's a heavy point to consider.
It does connect very strongly. That's the women as caregivers discourse. And the core idea is how these caregiving roles, especially being a mother, really influence women's experiences and often motivate their actions on climate change.
So motherhood is a driver for climate action.
Yeah, that came through really clearly. You had interviewees like Jessie saying things like, as a mother, it's a moral obligation to work for better health. For some, like a participant named Kylie, the physical act of giving birth created this really unique, almost visceral sense of connection across generations and a feeling of responsibility.
I can definitely see how powerful that connection would feel. And it sounds like something nonprofits pick up on strategically.
Oh, absolutely. Many environmental groups intentionally use storylines about motherhood and protecting children's future to make the climate message more relatable, maybe less politically charged.
Softening the message, almost.
Kind of. As one interviewee said, you can't really say bad things about mothers. It allows them to connect with a wider audience, sometimes even sidestepping the term climate change itself and focusing instead on things like children's health.
But this isn't just a narrative strategy, right? There's a real emotional weight that comes with it.
A huge one. The research talks about an emotional burden storyline. Women often carry the weight of worrying about the future, about what climate change means for their kids, their families. That mental health impact is significant.
And how does that compare to men, according to the study?
Well, it contrasts it with stereotypes suggesting men might struggle more to express those kinds of emotions openly, which could lead to its own kind of internal distress, maybe an inability to process those climate anxieties.
Powerful. That link between motherhood and motivation. But I guess I have to ask, does focusing so much on women as caregivers, even if it works for messaging, risk reinforcing those old stereotypes? You know, that women are supposed to be the nurturing ones.
That's a really important tension, and the research definitely flags it. On the one hand, caregiving is a reality, a lived experience for many women, often because of social conditioning. It's valid to acknowledge that.
Wow.
But there's also significant pushback noted in the study against essentializing it, saying women are naturally more nurturing. Scholars quoted are saying we need to ask why men are often not expected to be nurturing in the same way.
So it's about recognizing reality without locking people into stereotypes for the future.
Exactly. Recognizing current roles without making them seem like fixed biological destinies that limit everyone.
Okay, moving on. Let's challenge some assumptions with the next one. The women as knowledgeable discourse. This sounds interesting, the idea that women are seen as well-informed, maybe even less prone to climate skepticism than men.
It's a fascinating finding. The data does suggest women are, on average, slightly more likely to believe climate change is a serious issue and also to take personal actions.
Any ideas why?
Well, one researcher in the study, Christy, shared these really compelling anecdotes from public talks she gave. She often found retired white males were the most vocal skeptics, sometimes bringing up arguments about sunspots that, the vast majority of climate scientists have long since moved past.
Implying a kind of misplaced confidence in their own expertise sometimes?
That's one interpretation offered, yeah. A confidence maybe not always grounded in the current scientific consensus.
Okay, so women might be more receptive to the science, and does this discourse also suggest they're passing knowledge on?
Yes, very much so. There's a strong mothers as educators storyline. Women are often seen as instilling environmental ethics in their families from a young age, influencing things like household consumption habits.
Like teaching kids to turn off lights, recycle, that sort of thing.
Exactly. One participant, Swati, who immigrated from India, talked about her parents teaching a strong ethic of conservation, of not being wasteful, which she still practices daily. Things like turning off lights become ingrained.
Where does this knowledge primarily come from? Is it formal science education or more everyday stuff?
The research suggests a lot of it is practical, everyday knowledge stemming from those traditional gender divisions of labor we talked about.
So like women might know more about food waste because they manage the kitchen.
Right, and men might know more about, say, home energy use or car maintenance. The concern raised here is whether that crucial local daily knowledge often held by women gets kind of pushed aside in big policy debates.
Because the official experts are often defined differently, maybe more academic, often from the global north.
Precisely. That practical lived experience knowledge might not have the same weight as a PhD or a technical report, even if it's vital.
And it sounds like even when women do have the formal credentials, their expertise still gets challenged.
Oh, definitely. That came through loud and clear. Linda, an advocate with a biology degree, talked about her frustration being dismissed by politicians as just an uninformed housewife.
Wow.
And Allison, who teaches university courses on climate adaptation, talked about being mansplained on the topic by her chiropractor. Yeah, it points to these really deep-seated biases about who looks like an expert, whose voice is assumed to carry authority on technical topics.
And this problem surely connects to STEM fields too. Science, tech, engineering, math. Women are still underrepresented there, right?
Very much so. And interviewees talked a lot about the huge challenges women face trying to balance demanding science careers with family
Is
responsibilities.
there data on that?
Yeah, a 2019 study found that 43% of women who become mothers for the first time leave their full-time STEM jobs afterwards. That's compared to just 23% of new fathers.
That's a huge difference.
Often attributed to the perception that these fields just aren't set up to accommodate the realities of parenting, especially when women still shoulder a disproportionate amount of the care
So pulling
work at
this
home.
thread together, what's the big takeaway from this women as knowledgeable discourse? It feels like it's about way more than just individual experiences.
It really is. It forces us to rethink what we even mean by expertise. And it challenges these existing power dynamics that tend to privilege certain types of knowledge, often technical, often male-dominated, often from the global north, over other equally valid, crucial forms of knowing.
It's about broadening the definition of who gets to be an expert.
Exactly. Recognizing that valuable insights come from many places, and that narrow definitions can shut out perspectives we desperately need.
Which leads us really nicely into the final discourse, women as agents. This one sounds more active, focusing on women actually doing the work, being part of the solution.
That's right. This discourse highlights the widespread, vital participation of women in climate action, often in roles like organizing, community outreach, marketing, communications within environmental groups.
The engine room sometime?
Often, yeah. And many are driven by this deep personal desire to make a difference. It's not just a job, it's a commitment, often fueled by long-standing passion.
I like those stories in the research, like Abigail, who started an environment crimes after club when she was just 11.
Right. Or Shay, whose interest sparked in college learning about environmental justice. It shows this isn't some new trend. Women have been engaged for a long
And just the sheer number of women involved is seen as important in itself.
Absolutely. As one participant put it, pretty bluntly, they're half the population. Their presence is seen as a source of strength, pride, and inspiration within the movement, a diverse, powerful force.
But there's a but coming, isn't there?
Yeah.
Despite all this participation, there's a disconnect when it comes to leadership.
That's the major conflict highlighted here. Yes, women are doing a ton of the work, but they're often significantly underrepresented in the top leadership positions.
And in certain fields.
And in fields often perceived as more masculine, like engineering or high-level policymaking. Rebecca, a nonprofit worker in the study, made the point that women in the sector are frequently overworked and underpaid.
Which leads to burnout, I imagine.
Exactly. Which can mean that those top spots, they often remain dominated by what interviewees called good old boys clubs or even silverbacks.
Silverbacks. Like gorillas.
Yeah. Older, often white men who tend to maintain the existing power structures and ways of thinking. And this imbalance, it directly affects the kinds of analysis that get done, the types of solutions that get prioritized. It narrows the focus.
Are there other, maybe more subtle barriers women face when they are in those spaces?
Definitely. There's pressure to conform. Brittany, another nonprofit worker, talked about learning to not be so passionate, to consciously take the emotion away from her arguments, because she felt she wouldn't be taken seriously otherwise. Even though climate change is inherently emotional for so many people, it's like you have to suppress parts of yourself, maybe seen as feminine traits, to gain credibility in male-dominated arenas.
That sounds exhausting. And it goes even deeper, right? The research mentioned symbolic inclusion.
Yeah. This is where women, maybe especially women of color or women from the global south, get invited to the table, perhaps to speak at a big conference.
It's like a photo op.
Kind of. They're included as props, as one person put it, or maybe as motivational speakers, but their actual expertise isn't deeply valued. Their presence is symbolic, but it doesn't translate into real influence on policy or decisions. It's performative.
And what about women who really push the envelope? Figures like Greta Thunberg or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US, they challenge the status quo directly.
And they often face incredibly intense gendered attacks for doing so. Ridicule, dismissal, focusing on their appearance or tone rather than their arguments.
Why is that hostility often so gendered?
The research suggests strong links between climate denial, or resistance to major climate action, and holding on to quite rigid traditional gender norms, especially certain ideas about masculinity that feel threatened by calls for fundamental change or perceived loss of control.
This also connects to critiques of certain solutions, doesn't it? Like techno fixes.
It does. Things like large-scale geoengineering projects. These are often proposed and dominated by men. They tend to reinforce ideas of controlling nature.
And they're sometimes seen as ways to avoid the harder systemic changes.
Exactly. Critics call them false solutions. They might promise a quick fix for the climate without requiring us to actually change our consumption patterns, our economic systems, our political structures. It's like that analogy one interviewee used, trying to fix a bathtub that's overflowing by just mopping the floor instead of turning off the tap or fixing the hole.
Treating the symptom, not the cause. Okay, one last area this discourse touches on: consumption. Women are often painted as the main shoppers, agonizing over green choices in the supermarket.
Yeah, that silly internal struggles, quote. But the research really pushes back against the stereotype of the feminization of the shopaholic.
How so? Is it not true?
Well, it's more complex. Some studies show men actually tend to score higher on materialism and conspicuous consumption buying things to show status. Women might be more prone to impulse buys. But the bigger point is that everyone's consumption is shaped by way more than gender.
Like income, class, advertising, availability.
Exactly. Economic structures, societal norms, blaming it all on individual women's choices in the supermarket is really misleading and ignores the systemic drivers of overconsumption.
So the question becomes, how do we get sustainable changes in consumption if we keep framing it as this individual, often gendered responsibility?
That's the big challenge, isn't it? The research strongly argues that focusing only on individual choices is often too expensive for many people. It can create class divisions about who gets to be green, and it lets the larger systems off the hook.
We need to look bigger picture. at the structures.
Definitely. Understanding consumption as deeply embedded in our social, economic, and political systems is crucial for any real lasting change.
Okay, wow. We
Yeah.
have covered a lot of ground here. We've journeyed through these really complex, sometimes subtle, sometimes stark ways that gender intersects with climate change,
Yeah, from shaping how we even understand vulnerability and care,
to influencing whose knowledge counts as expert.
and who feels empowered or is allowed to take action, and in what ways.
So, for you listening, what does this all mean? Well, clearly, your own understanding of climate change, and maybe how you choose to engage with it or not engage with it, it's influenced by these powerful, often invisible ways of talking and thinking.
These discourses are operating in the background, shaping perceptions, setting expectations. They affect who gets heard, what solutions get
And
considered.
in a world that's facing, as one interviewee starkly put it, a famine of compassion, and where we still seem drawn to these big techno fixes that might just reinforce the old power structures.
Maybe the most powerful path forward isn't just about new solar panels or carbon taxes, as important as those are.
What if it's also about something more fundamental?
What if it's about a radical reevaluation? Rethinking who we listen to, whose knowledge we value, whose voices get amplified, and maybe how we collectively define what it really means to care for the planet and for each other.
This certainly suggests the answer is far more complex, far more nuanced than maybe we first thought.
Definitely something to keep mulling over.